Humans hide their true strength. Here is why. The Kryx fleet came through the Kessler Gate in a formation that took 11 hours to fully translate into real space. 600 warships unfolding out of the wound in the void like something being born. And Admiral Yusuf Okonkwo-Blackwood watched the sensor plot fill with hostile contacts from the command deck of the UNS Attrition and felt nothing that could honestly be called surprise. He had known this day was coming for 6 years, ever since the first Kryx scout drone had been dragged out of the ice of a Kuiper belt monitoring station with its optics still recording, and he had spent every one of those 6 years preparing for exactly this math problem. 600 ships of a species that had been building warships since before humanity had domesticated fire, against 200 vessels cobbled together from refitted mining haulers, decommissioned pre-war cruisers, and whatever the shipyards at Ceres and Titan could churn out on a wartime footing that never quite stopped feeling like triage. The UNS Attrition herself was, in the unforgiving light of what she had once been built for, an embarrassment of a flagship, a converted bulk or hauler, her hull plating a patchwork of scavenged armor salvaged from 3 decommissioned pre-war cruisers. Her reactor core running 20% past its rated safety margin on a permanent basis, because 20% past rated margin was the only way she generated enough power to keep her jury-rigged shield generators functional against anything the Kryx could throw at her. Her corridors smelled permanently of recycled air pushed one cycle too many past its filtration limit, a faint, sour staleness that every crew member aboard had long since stopped noticing, and every new transfer spent their first week quietly gagging against. Water rationing had been in effect for 4 years, showers limited to 90 seconds twice weekly, a hardship that had, in the strange alchemy of wartime culture, become a point of grim pride rather than complaint among a crew who had watched worse ships than theirs simply cease to exist. Below decks, in the cramped berthing compartments that had once held raw or rather than sleeping sailors, injured crew from the war's earlier engagements lived alongside the able-bodied missing limbs replaced by cheap, mass-produced prosthetics that whined audibly with every movement. Faces scarred by decompression burns that the fleet's overworked medical corps had never had the resources or the downtime to properly treat. A walking, breathing catalog of 6 years of a war fought with equipment that had never been designed for the scale of violence it was now expected to survive. "Confirmed Count Admiral," said Commander Priya Nazari, his chief of staff, her voice flat in the particular way that meant she had already run the numbers 3 times hoping for a different answer each time. 604 capital-grade vessels, cross-referencing against the intelligence packet from the Ganymede listening post. That's the 2nd and 4th Kryx battle fleets combined under a single unified command. They haven't done that in the 11 years we've been tracking their military structure. This is everything they have in this sector, Admiral. This is the whole hand. Then it's a good thing we've never once shown them ours, Okonkwo-Blackwood said, and turned from the display to look at the ragged, patchwork sensor returns of his own fleet. 200 ships scattered across 4 defensive lines stretched thin across the approaches to Sol, and felt the old, familiar weight settle back into his chest, the weight he had carried since the Kryx first burned Proxima Station to slag 11 years ago in what their diplomatic corps had, with genuine and apparently sincere confusion, described afterward as a regrettable misunderstanding of territorial boundary protocol. He had buried friends from that misunderstanding. He had buried more since. He did not intend to bury the species. "They're transmitting, Admiral," said Lieutenant Commander Di-Young Cho at the communications station, a young officer who had joined the fleet 3 years into the war and had never once in that time seen a battle that ended in anything other than grinding, costly attrition. "Standard first contact frequency. Requesting visual." Put it up." The image that resolved on the main display was almost aggressively serene. A Kryx command bridge, all soft amber light and curved bioceramic surfaces, populated by tall, elegant figures whose chitinous skin caught the light in shifting patterns of blue and violet. And at its center, seated in a command throne carved from what looked like fossilized coral, a figure whose bearing radiated the particular calm of a species that had never, in the entire recorded span of its interstellar history, lost a war it chose to fight. High Marshal Thessarian Vale inclined his elongated head in a gesture that some long-dead xenolinguist had catalogued as respect, though 11 years of war had taught Okonkwo-Blackwood to read it as something closer to pity. Admiral Okonkwo-Blackwood, Vale said, his translated voice carrying a musical, unhurried cadence that made every word sound like it had been considered for a decade before being spoken. I had hoped, when the Compact of Species first flagged your world for correction, that we would not arrive at this juncture. 600 warships stand between your homeworld and this fleet's forward edge. 200 stand in opposition. I have studied your species' history with genuine interest. Admiral, your capacity for stubbornness is, I confess, without precedent in our records. But stubbornness is not strategy, and I would ask you, one commander to another, to consider whether the 11 billion souls on the world behind you deserve to inherit the consequences of a fight you cannot mathematically win. Funny thing about math, Marshal, Okonkwo-Blackwood said, settling back into his command chair with the unhurried ease of a man who had given this exact answer in one form or another at 11 different negotiating tables over 11 years of war. You keep doing it with the numbers you can see: ship count, tonnage, weapons yield per hull, all the numbers that go on a spec sheet. He leaned forward, and something in his weathered, scarred face hardened into an expression that made even the young communications officer beside him go very still. I've been doing a different kind of math for 6 years, Marshal. I've been doing the math on how many of my people I'm willing to lose to make sure the 604 ships behind you go home short. And I want you to understand something before this starts, because I don't think your species has ever actually had to learn it. That number for me is not small, it is not comfortable, it is not honorable by whatever definition your compact taught you, but it is a great deal larger than yours. Vale was quiet for a long moment, his bioluminescent patterns shifting through a slow, contemplative wave of blue. That, he said finally, is precisely what I was afraid you would say. The first shots of the Battle of the Sol approaches were fired 4 hours later, at a range of 11 light seconds, and within the first 90 minutes of engagement, the UNS Vigilance, a converted ice hauler with a crew of 431, most of them reservists who had been asteroid miners 18 months earlier, took a graviton lance through her forward magazine and ceased, in the space of a single silent heartbeat that no external sensor could properly capture. To be a ship at all, there was no explosion visible from a distance, no dramatic fireball. There was simply a bright, brief flare of released energy, and then a debris field where 431 people had been standing at their stations. And Admiral Okonkwo-Blackwood watched the icon wink out on his tactical display and made himself keep his eyes open, because he had promised himself 11 years ago that he would never again let himself look away from what this war actually cost. Elsewhere along Line Alpha, the fighting had none of the clean, instantaneous mercy of the Vigilance's death. Aboard the UNS Kestrel Run, a Corvette-class escort with a crew of 91, a graviton near-miss sheared open the aft engineering section rather than obliterating the ship outright. And for the 11 minutes it took the vessel's damage control teams to seal the breach, 3 engineering ratings drowned in their own blood as decompression ruptured capillaries throughout their lungs before emergency bulkheads finally slammed shut. Their bodies left tumbling in the freezing vacuum of the ruptured compartment because no one could spare the time, in the middle of an active engagement, to retrieve them. Aboard the UNS Holloway, a converted freighter serving as a makeshift troop in materiel transport, a hull breach flooded 2 decks with a fine choking mist of ruptured coolant lines, and the ship's medical bay, already overwhelmed with burn casualties from an earlier skirmish, found itself treating chemical exposure alongside decompression trauma with a triage system that had, by the battle's 3rd hour, effectively collapsed into a grim, unspoken policy of treating whoever screamed loudest and letting the quiet ones wait, because the quiet ones, more often than not, had already stopped being able to feel what was killing them. "Vigilance is gone, Admiral," Nazari said, her voice carefully, professionally empty. "No survivors detected. Kryx forward elements continuing advance on Line Alpha." "Understood. Order Line Alpha to begin the fallback pattern. Full retreat, staggered by squadron, and I want it to look ragged, Priya. I want it to look exactly like what it would look like if we were actually panicking." Zai Admirals. The retreat itself staged across 6 hours. And 4 separate defensive echelons, cost the fleet 11 more ships beyond the Vigilance before it was done. Each loss folded into the broader performance of desperation that Okonkwo-Blackwood had ordered his squadron commanders to project even as they executed, with careful and deliberate precision, a withdrawal pattern that had been drilled into the fleet's doctrine for the better part of a year specifically for this contingency. The UNS Longwatch, covering the retreat of the fleet's third echelon, took sustained fire for 11 minutes past the point any sane commander would have called acceptable, her captain holding position not out of panic, but because Okonkwo-Blackwood's withdrawal timetable required exactly that 11 minutes of cover, and lost 61 crew to a compartment fire that damage control could not fully suppress before the ship finally disengaged. Her survivors fighting the blaze in vacuum suits inside a hull filling with smoke that the failing life support system could no longer scrub fast enough to keep breathable. It was the kind of loss that, in a war fought by a fleet with the luxury of choosing its engagements freely, might have been avoided. In the grinding mathematics of Okonkwo-Blackwood's 6-year campaign, it was simply the cost of making a retreat look convincing enough that 600 Kryx warships would follow it, unsuspecting, into exactly the trap it was designed to lead them toward. What followed, across the next 6 hours, was a retreat that looked, to every sensor operator on every Kryx bridge in the advancing fleet, like precisely what 6 years of intelligence assessments had led the Kryx High Command to expect from a species fighting a war it could not win. A slow, chaotic, increasingly desperate withdrawal, human ships falling back in ragged formation, taking losses at a rate that any rational military calculus would have called unsustainable, retreating from the outer defensive line toward the cluster of mining colonies that ringed the asteroid belt designation HFY 7. A system whose only strategic value, according to every piece of intelligence the Kryx had gathered over a decade of careful reconnaissance, was the 41,000 civilians who called its 3 habitat stations home. High Marshal Vale watched the retreat unfold on his own tactical display with the particular satisfaction of a commander whose predictions were, so far, proving entirely correct, and turned to his own chief of staff, a scarred veteran named Asa Threll who had served with him through 3 prior campaigns. "They are falling back toward HFY 7. That system has no defensive value. Why retreat toward it rather than toward Earth itself?" "Perhaps toward, and not simply through, Marshal," Threll offered, though there was uncertainty in the translated cadence of her voice. "Human tactical doctrine has on prior occasions shown a preference for consolidating around inhabited systems, presumably out of some instinct toward protection." "Then let us not disappoint that instinct," Vale said. "Advance the Second Fleet's forward elements to pursue and engage. Cut off their retreat at HFY 7 before they can fully consolidate. I would rather end this quickly than allow it to become the kind of grinding, costly affair their history suggests they prefer." It was, Okonkwo-Blackwood would reflect much later, in the quiet, sleepless hours after the battle, the single easiest tactical prediction he had made in 6 years of war, because he had spent 4 of those years studying Kryx military doctrine with the particular, obsessive thoroughness of a man who understood that he could not outbuild his enemy and would therefore have to outthink him instead. And he had learned across 4 years of study. One fact about Kryx warfare that their own military academies apparently considered too fundamental to ever question. The Kryx did not target civilian populations, not out of squeamishness, but out of a rigid, ancient code of honorable engagement that treated the deliberate endangerment of non-combatants as a stain no victory could wash clean. It was, in a strange way, the single most admirable thing about them. It was also, Okonkwo-Blackwood had decided 6 years ago, the single largest exploitable weakness in their entire military psychology. Because a fleet that would not target civilians was a fleet that could be reliably predicted to move toward, rather than away from, a system full of them, if that system appeared to offer a tactical advantage to the side doing the retreating. The three habitat stations of HFY-7 had been evacuated 41 days earlier. Every one of the 41,000 civilians who had called them home relocated to hardened shelters deep within the rock of the system's largest asteroid. A fact known to exactly 11 people in the entire United Nations Space Command, all of whom had been sworn, under penalties that made ordinary military secrecy law look casual. Never to reveal it. What the Kryx advance fleet saw, as its forward elements pursued the retreating human line into the HFY-7 system, was three habitat stations reading full civilian occupancy on every passive sensor sweep, life support systems humming, thermal signatures consistent with tens of thousands of warm bodies going about the desperate, ordinary business of survival in a war zone. What the Kryx advance fleet did not see, because it had been buried under 11 meters of asteroid regolith and shielded behind three separate layers of signature masking technology that human engineers had spent 4 brutal years developing specifically for this single purpose, was the 912 fusion yield mines seeded through the asteroid field surrounding those stations, each one calibrated with a precision that had cost more human engineering hours than the entire Apollo program. Each one waiting. Second Fleet Forward elements entering the HFY-7 asteroid field, Marshall, Threll reported. Formation tightening to navigate the debris density. Human retreat pattern continuing toward the habitat stations. Good, Vale said. Order them to hold position at the field's edge rather than pursuing directly through it. I want no unnecessary risk to navigation in that density, and I want the human fleet to understand that further retreat gains them nothing. Open a channel. I would like to offer terms before this becomes any bloodier than it needs to be. The channel opened, and Admiral Okonkwo-Blackwood, watching 211 Kryx warships settle into a loose, confident holding pattern at the exact geometric center of the HFY-7 asteroid field, allowed himself, for the first time in 6 hours of carefully maintained calm, something that might almost have been called satisfaction. Marshal Vale, he said, you wanted to talk terms. I did, Admiral, and I still do, though I confess the tactical situation has grown more favorable to my position in the interim. Your fleet has retreated into a system with no defensible choke points, populated by civilians your own doctrine will not permit you to further endanger. I am prepared to offer generous terms of ceasefire, contingent on the immediate stand-down of remaining human forces in this sector. I appreciate the offer, Marshal, Okonkwo-Blackwood said. I do, and I want you to know before I answer that I don't take any pleasure in what I'm about to say next. There's nobody on those 3 stations behind you. There hasn't been for 41 days. Every civilian in this system is buried 11 meters deep in rock 200,000 kilometers from where you're currently sitting. And the only thing occupying the space your forward fleet is holding position in right now is 912 fusion warheads that my engineers spent 4 years hiding well enough that your sensors couldn't find them even now, with your whole fleet parked right on top of them. The silence on the Kryx bridge when the translation completed had a texture that Okonkwo-Blackwood had learned across 11 years of war to recognize instantly. The specific, total silence of a commander realizing, in real time, that he had just walked 211 ships into a trap built specifically around the one tactical assumption his entire species considered too fundamental to question. Detonate, Okonkwo-Blackwood said quietly and did not look away. What happened in the HFY-7 asteroid field in the next 4 seconds would, in the official Kryx military histories written decades later, be referred to only obliquely, in the careful clinical language military historians reserve for defeats too total and too strategically humiliating to describe in full 912 fusion warheads, detonating in a coordinated sequence calibrated down to the millisecond. Each one timed to a precise cascading pattern that turned the asteroid field itself into a weapon, sending a storm of superheated rock and plasma and shrapnel tearing through the heart of the Kryx Second Fleet's forward formation at velocities that made shield technology, however advanced, functionally irrelevant against debris the size of a starship traveling at a meaningful fraction of the speed of light. 211 ships had entered the field. 63 of them existed in any recognizable form 4 seconds later. The remainder were debris, or worse, hulls holed through by rock traveling too fast for any damage control team to do anything but watch pressure alarms scream in the last seconds before compartment after compartment blew out into vacuum. Crews suffocating in the sudden cold silence of decompression. The particular gruesome intimacy of watching a colleague's blood boil and freeze in the same instant as atmosphere vented from a ruptured hull. A horror that Okonkwo-Blackwood had never once had to witness personally, but had read about, in cold clinical detail in enough after action reports from both sides of this war that he no longer needed to imagine it. He simply knew it, the way a man who has spent 6 years planning a massacre knows the shape of what he has planned, in exhaustive, deliberate detail, long before the moment it actually happens. Confirmed kills 148 Kryx capital ships, Nazari said, her voice tight, professional, betraying nothing of whatever she felt watching 148,000 sentient beings die in 4 seconds on a tactical display that reduced the entire event to a cluster of icons switching from hostile active to destroyed. 63 vessels showing damage but continued function, retreating from the field at emergency burn. Admiral, that's the single largest single engagement kill count of the entire war, on either side. I know, Okonkwo-Blackwood said, and felt, in that moment, the particular hollow, grinding weight that he had learned, across 6 years of increasingly ruthless planning, was simply the price of doing this job the way it needed to be done. He did not feel triumph. He had stopped expecting to feel triumph somewhere around his 3rd year of command, when he had first begun to understand that winning this war would require becoming the kind of commander who could order the deaths of 148,000 strangers and feel, afterward, nothing but the cold, exhausted certainty that it had been necessary. Signal the retreating Kryx elements. Let them go. We're not pursuing into open engagement against a fleet still 4 times our remaining size. Let the survivors carry word back to the Marshal about exactly what happened here, and let him sit with it. On the bridge of what remained of the Kryx Second Fleet's command structure, Vale's own flagship, the Coral Ascendant, had been at the rear of the formation and survived the detonation with only minor damage, a fact he would spend the following weeks unable to decide whether to consider fortune or a deliberate cruelty on the part of an enemy who had apparently wanted him alive to witness the full scope of what had just happened. High Marshal Thessarian Vale stood in absolute frozen silence, watching the debris field where 2/3 of his advance fleet had existed moments earlier, and felt something that 11 years of unbroken, honorable military service had never once prepared him to feel. Not fear of defeat, which he had trained for and studied and considered in the abstract an acceptable professional risk. Fear of the enemy himself. Fear of a mind capable of planning, in exhaustive and patient detail across 4 years of preparation, the deliberate slaughter of 148,000 souls using the one tactical blind spot his entire civilization's military ethics had made a point of never developing, because that blind spot, the reflexive, honorable unwillingness to endanger civilians, had never, in 11 years of Kryx interstellar warfare, been exploited by any prior adversary. Because no prior adversary had been willing to sacrifice 41,000 of their own people's homes as bait, even homes that had been, in the end, empty. Marshal, Threll said quietly, her voice carrying a tremor that 11 years of service together had never once revealed before this moment, orders. Full withdrawal to the fleet's secondary staging point, Vale said, and his own voice when it emerged sounded to his own ears unfamiliar. I want a complete accounting of losses within the hour. And I want, he paused, searching for words in a language that suddenly felt inadequate to the moment, I want to understand what kind of species does this. Not for the report to the compact, for myself. He would spend the following 11 weeks trying, and largely failing, to find an answer that satisfied him, weeks that Admiral Okonkwo-Blackwood spent in a very different pursuit. The long, patient, grinding work of making sure the Kryx fleet's remaining 453 warships never again enjoyed the luxury of a clean supply line. 6 weeks after HFY-7, with the Kryx advance stalled into a wary, methodical crawl along the fleet's secondary defensive perimeter, Okonkwo-Blackwood authorized a second sacrifice, this one smaller in scale but no less deliberate in its cold arithmetic. The mining colony of Perth's Landing, a modest settlement of some 6,000 souls clinging to the icy crust of a moon in the outer reaches of the Corward system, sat directly along the projected advance route of the Kryx Fourth Fleet's cautious probing elements, and Okonkwo-Blackwood, reviewing the tactical projections with Nazari in the cramped confines of the attrition's war room, made the decision in less time than it took to finish reading the report. "Full evacuation, 48 hours, no exceptions," he said. "Get every civilian off that moon and into the shelter network at Corward Station. Then I want the colonies are. Remaining infrastructure left running exactly as it is, power grid active, life support cycling, every thermal and electromagnetic signature reading full occupancy. And I want the mining tunnels beneath the main settlement seeded with everything ordnance can spare." The evacuation itself was, for the 6,000 miners and their families who lived it, a particular species of controlled panic transport ships arriving in staggered waves across a bare 2 days. Families given hours rather than weeks to decide what of a lifetime's accumulated belongings could fit into a single regulation duffel. Elderly residents who had lived on Perth's Landing since its founding 40 years earlier loaded onto evacuation shuttles by exhausted naval logistics officers who had no time to explain more than the barest minimum of why. Only that they needed to move now, and that questions would have to wait. No one outside the 11 people cleared to know the full plan was told that their homes would, within days, become the detonation point for a second HFY-7. And the evacuees who later learned, months or years afterward, exactly what their emptied town had been used for, carried that knowledge in different ways, some with a grim, unsentimental pride at having contributed, however unknowingly, to a war their species desperately needed to win, others with a quieter, more private grief at the thought of the homes they would never see again, reduced to rubble not by an enemy's hand, but by their own government's calculated sacrifice. Admiral Nazari said, and there was something in her voice that had not been there before HFY-7, a fatigue that went beyond the physical. "We're going to keep doing this every time they give us an opening, aren't we? Every colony that sits in their path becomes another trap. Every colony that sits in their path and can be fully evacuated without them noticing becomes another trap," Okonkwo-Blackwood corrected quietly, without any pretense that the distinction made the decision easier to live with. "The day we run out of colonies we can empty in time, or the day they stop falling for it, is the day we find a different answer. Until then, Priya, this is the answer we have." The Kryx probing force that entered the Perth's Landing system 11 days later, wary after HFY-7, but unable to identify any anomaly in the colony's sensor signature that their doctrine could justify treating as sufficient cause to bypass an apparently populated, apparently undefended settlement, lost 41 ships to a detonation sequence considerably smaller than the one that had gutted the Second Fleet's advance guard. But no less final for the crews aboard those 41 vessels, and High Marshal Vale, receiving the report of a second colony trap in as many months, understood, with a dread that had begun to feel less like a passing emotion and more like a permanent fixture of his command, that HFY-7 had not been an isolated, desperate gambit. It had been a demonstration of method, a method Admiral Okonkwo-Blackwood intended to repeat for as long as the war continued and the opportunity presented itself. regardless of how many times it required treating his own species' homes as expendable ordnance. The human fleet's raiding squadrons, small, fast, expendable groups of 3 to 5 ships each, crewed by volunteers who understood with total and unflinching clarity that their survival rate on any given mission hovered somewhere in the range that peacetime commanders would have called unconscionable, began in the weeks following Perth's landing, a campaign against Kryx supply lines that would, over the following 4 months, come to define the war's second and bloodiest phase. The UNS Gutter Cat, a converted freight hauler with a crew of 41 under the command of a hard-eyed lieutenant named Sarah Okoy, intercepted a Kryx logistics convoy in the debris-choked outer reaches of the Sarn system 3 weeks after Hestia 7. A convoy of 6 unarmed supply haulers escorted by only 2 frigates. And the engagement that followed lasted less than 9 minutes and cost the Gutter Cat 11 crew to decompression when a frigate's point-defense fire clipped her aft hull before the raiding squadron's return fire disabled both escorts. But it also cost the Kryx war effort 400,000 tons of refined antimatter fuel, 3 months of accumulated ration stores for an entire battle group, and more critically than either, the psychological certainty. Built over 11 years of largely uncontested logistics operations, that supply convoys operating outside the fleet's main defensive umbrella were safe. They were not safe. Nothing in the months that followed was safe, and Okonkwo-Blackwood made certain the entire Kryx war effort understood this with a thoroughness that bordered on the pedagogical. Human raiding squadrons struck supply convoys in the Sarn system, in the long, empty transit lanes of the core. Eward approach, in the shipyard staging grounds of 3 separate forward operating bases that the Kryx had, until that point, considered too deep in secured territory to require meaningful defense. They mined transit corridors with the same patient, exhaustive thoroughness that had turned the Hestia 7 asteroid field into a killing ground, seeding entire stretches of hyperlane approach with dormant explosive charges that could sit inert for months, indistinguishable from background radiation, until a passing convoy's mass signature triggered a detonation sequence calibrated to look, on every surviving sensor log, like catastrophic and coincidental engine failure. They struck refueling depots. They struck the slow, lumbering antimatter production platforms that the Kryx war machine depended on to keep 600 warships fed, platforms that took years to construct, and in the hands of a fleet commander willing to accept the crew losses involved in getting close enough to plant the charges, could be reduced to slag in a single coordinated strike lasting under 4 minutes. The cost to humanity across those 4 months was not small. Okonkwo-Blackwood watched the casualty reports accumulate on his private terminal each night with the same grim, unflinching attention he had brought to every decision of the war, refusing the easy comfort of delegating that particular duty to a subordinate, because he had promised himself 6 years earlier that he would never let the war's mathematics become abstract to him, would never let the ships on his tactical display become mere icons rather than the 431 people who had died aboard the Vigilance, the 11 who had died aboard the Gutter Cat, the steadily climbing toll of raiding squadron crews who did not come home from missions that had, by design, never offered them good odds of coming home at all. 311 human ships were lost across those 4 months of supply line raiding, more than the fleet's total remaining strength at the war's outset, replaced only by the desperate round-the-clock production of the shipyards at Ceres and Titan, and increasingly by converted civilian vessels, whose owners volunteered them for the war effort with a grim, unsentimental patriotism that Okonkwo-Blackwood found. On the rare occasions he allowed himself to feel anything at all about the war beyond exhausted calculation, the single most humbling thing he witnessed across the entire conflict. But the Kryx war machine, built across centuries on the comfortable assumption of unchallenged logistics superiority, began, for the first time in its long and largely uncontested history, to genuinely starve. Antimatter production fell 40% below sustainment requirements within the first 2 months of the raiding campaign. Ration stores, calibrated for a war that Kryx military planning had assumed, would be won within a single decisive engagement rather than dragged into a grinding, months-long campaign of attrition, began running critically short across three separate battle groups. Repair yards denied the steady flow of raw materials that 600 warships required simply to remain combat functional after the ordinary wear of extended deployment, fell further and further behind on essential maintenance, until entire squadrons of Kryx capital ships found themselves limping through space with damaged shield generators and degraded weapon systems that no amount of crew discipline could fully compensate for. The fighting during those 4 months was never confined to the raiding campaign alone. Along the fleet's remaining defensive lines, the war ground on in a slow, exhausting rhythm of feint and counterfeint that cost both sides ships in numbers too steady and too unglamorous to ever make it into the histories that would later be written about HFY 7. Human squadrons would advance to probe a weakened Kryx picket line, trade fire for 11 or 12 minutes, and fall back the moment the engagement's cost curve stopped favoring them, a discipline that Okonkwo-Blackwood had drilled into every squadron commander in the fleet with an almost religious insistence. No engagement was worth fighting to the last ship unless the math specifically required it, and most engagements in the unglamorous middle months of a war of attrition did not. The UNS Halcyon Drift, a light cruiser under the command of a young lieutenant commander named Ibrahim Akafur, spent 11 consecutive weeks running exactly this pattern along the fleet's southern perimeter, advancing and retreating in a slow, grinding rhythm that cost her crew 3 dead and 41 wounded across a dozen separate skirmishes. Each wound and each death logged and mourned and folded back into the relentless calculus of a fleet that could not afford to lose a single ship it did not have to lose, and could not afford either to let any single loss slow the broader campaign's momentum. It was during one such counterattack in the 8th week of the raiding campaign that the UNS Gutter Cat undertook the mission that would, in the private oral history the raiding squadrons told each other in the cramped mess halls of their patched-together ships, become the single most cited example of the campaign's particular grinding brutality. Lieutenant Okoy's squadron, the Gutter Cat and 2 smaller escort corvettes, the Widow's Reach and the Long Odds, had been tasked with striking a Kryx forward repair yard tucked into the debris field of a dead moon in the Corward approach, a facility responsible for returning damaged capital ships to frontline service at a rate the fleet's intelligence analysts considered unacceptably efficient. The approach took 11 hours at reduced thrust to avoid detection, 11 hours during which the squadron's combined crew of 131 people sat at battle stations, in ships with life support systems straining under the load of full combat readiness, maintained far longer than any peacetime safety protocol would have permitted, breathing air that grew steadily staler and warmer as the hours ground on, nerves fraying under the particular silent tension of a crew that knew, with total clarity, that the mission ahead offered no realistic prospect of a clean, bloodless outcome. The strike itself lasted 4 minutes. The Gutter Cat and her escorts came in on a ballistic approach vector calculated to minimize their engine signature, released their full ordnance load against the repair yard's exposed reactor cores at point-blank range, and turned to burn clear before the facility's point-defense grid could fully spin up, a plan that worked exactly as intended for the Gutter Cat and the Long Odds, and failed catastrophically for the Widow's Reach, whose helm officer, exhausted past the point of reliable judgment after 11 hours at battle stations, misjudged the ship's turn radius by a margin that would, under any other circumstance, have been survivable, and instead put her directly into the path of a defensive graviton lance that had, moments earlier, seemed to be tracking the Gutter Cat instead. The Widow's Reach did not simply lose crew. She lost herself entirely in the same silent, instantaneous fashion the Vigilance had months earlier. 41 souls extinguished in the same fraction of a second. It took Lieutenant Okoy to key her calm and confirm, in a voice that would not fully steady again for 3 days, that the strike had succeeded and that they were, in fact, coming home short. 41 dead, Okonkwo-Blackwood said quietly, reading the after-action report in the small hours of the following morning, alone in his cabin aboard the attrition, the particular privacy of grief he allowed himself only in these narrow, unwatched windows of time. 41 dead to take out a repair yard that'll cost them 8 months to rebuild. He set the report down, and for a long moment simply sat with the weight of it, the way he had trained himself across 6 years, never to let himself skip past that weight in pursuit of the next decision. 8 months, he said again to the empty cabin, as though saying it aloud made the trade feel less obscene than it did in the cold, silent arithmetic of his own head. It never did. He had stopped expecting it to, somewhere around the war's 3rd year, and had settled instead for simply making sure the arithmetic, however obscene, kept coming out in his species' favor. Not every desperate tactic in the raiding campaign's grinding middle months relied on stealth or explosives. In the 11th week, a squadron of 9 Kryx capital ships pressed a sudden, aggressive advance against the human fleet's badly stretched southern picket, exploiting a gap in coverage that 3 separate raiding operations had opened by pulling ships away from the main defensive line, and the squadron commander holding that gap, a grim, taciturn captain named Elena Marchetti aboard the UNS Last Resort. A decommissioned bulk freighter refitted so hastily for wartime service that her crew had taken to calling her the Coffin with the particular gallows humor that had become the fleet's dominant emotional register, found herself with 4 ships, no meaningful ordnance reserves after 3 consecutive engagements, and 9 Kryx cruisers bearing down on a defensive line that, if it broke, would open a direct approach corridor toward the shipyards at Ceres. She made the only decision the mathematics left available to her. "All ships, this is Marchetti," she said over the squadron channel, her voice carrying the flat, exhausted calm of a commander who had already made peace with what she was about to order. "We're out of missiles. We're down to point defense rounds that won't scratch their armor. So we're going to do this the old-fashioned way. Full military thrust, ramming vectors on the lead 3 cruisers. Helm, target their engine sections if you can. Thread it, we might survive a glancing hit to a drive core better than a dead center hit to a reactor. If you can't thread it, put us through the hull anyway. I'm not asking anyone to do something I'm not doing myself. Last resort's going in first." What followed, in the 11 minutes that comprised the engagement later logged in fleet records simply as the Ceres Gap action, was a species of violence that even 6 years of increasingly ruthless warfare had not yet produced in quite this form. 4 human ships, stripped of conventional ordnance, accelerating toward 9 Kryx cruisers at velocities that turned their own mass into the only weapon they had left. 480,000 tons of refitted freighter and decommissioned cruiser hull converted, in the space of a single desperate tactical decision, into kinetic projectiles traveling fast enough that the Kryx point-defense grids, designed to intercept missiles and energy weapons rather than entire warships on collision courses, could not generate enough intercepting fire to stop them in time. The Last Resort took a glancing graviton hit to her forward hull at 11 seconds from impact that killed 19 of her crew in the forward compartments, and did nothing at all to slow her closing velocity, and struck the lead Kryx cruiser's engineering section at a combined closing speed that turned both ships into a single spreading cloud of wreckage and flamelit debris. 411 Kryx crew and the 61 surviving members of the Last Resort's own crew dying together, in an impact so violent that the tactical sensors of every other ship in the engagement briefly lost resolution in the sheer density of the resulting debris field. 2 more human ships achieved similar catastrophic kills against 2 more Kryx cruisers in the minutes that followed. The 4th, the UNS Widowmaker, missed her intended target by a margin narrow enough to clip the Kryx cruiser's outer hull rather than striking dead center, and spent the following 90 seconds tumbling, crippled but intact, through the debris field her sister ships had created, her crew alive barely in a ship that would never fly again. Captain Marchetti did not survive the Ceres Gap action. Neither did 231 of the crew who had served under her across the 4 ships that made the run, but the 6 remaining Kryx cruisers, having watched 3 of their number annihilated by an enemy willing to convert entire crude warships into unguided kinetic weapons rather than surrender a defensive line, broke off the advance and withdrew, and the shipyards at Ceres continued production, uninterrupted, for the remainder of the war. Admiral Okonkwo-Blackwood, reviewing the engagement report 2 days later, ordered Marchetti's name added to the same private list he kept unofficially in the back pages of a physical notebook he had carried since the war's second year. A list that had by that point grown long enough that he had stopped counting the names on it and started instead simply making sure each new one was recorded correctly with the correct rank, the correct ship, the correct date. A small private discipline that felt, to him, like the least he owed the people whose deaths his strategy required. High Marshal Vale watched this slow, grinding collapse unfold across 4 months of increasingly desperate logistics reports with a mounting horror that had, by the campaign's 3rd month, entirely displaced the professional detachment he had spent a career cultivating. He convened emergency councils with his surviving fleet commanders in the sterile amber light of the Coral Ascendant's war room, watched supply projections that had once shown comfortable, sustainable margins collapse instead into stark, unforgiving deficits, and understood with a clarity that felt less like military analysis and more like slowly drowning, that his species was fighting an enemy who had made a decision somewhere in the earliest days of this war that no cost was too high. No tactic too dishonorable, no sacrifice of civilians, of ships, of the crews aboard those ships too great, provided it brought the war's ultimate outcome one increment closer to the only acceptable result. It was not a mindset his own species' military doctrine had ever developed, because it was not a mindset his own species' military doctrine could survive contact with intact. "We could sue for a ceasefire," Threll offered, in the grim silence of the 7th Emergency Council of the campaign's 4th month, her own bioluminescent patterns dimmed to a weary, exhausted gray that 11 years of prior warfare had never once produced in her. "Withdraw to secured territory, consolidate, rebuild our logistics capacity before resuming." "Before resuming what exactly?" Vale asked, and there was no anger in the question, only a bone-deep exhaustion that had nothing to do with physical fatigue. "Before resuming a war against a species that has demonstrated repeatedly and with escalating thoroughness that it will do whatever the mathematics of victory require, regardless of cost. We withdraw, we rebuild, and in a year or 5 or 10, we return with a larger fleet better prepared, and Admiral Okonkwo-Blackwood, I have no doubt, spends that same year or 5 or 10 preparing a deeper asteroid field, a more thorough sabotage of our logistics, a trap built around whatever new blind spot our doctrine has not yet learned to close. This is not a war with an endpoint I can see any longer, Threll. This is a war against an opponent who has decided, apparently as a matter of fundamental philosophy, that there is no line he will not cross to win it, and I do not believe our species possesses the capacity to match that philosophy without ceasing to be the species we currently are. It was in the end not a single battle that ended the war, but a single conversation, opened 4 months and 11 days after the detonation at HFY 7, on a private channel between 2 flagships separated by 11 light minutes of cold, debris-strewn space, and Admiral Yusuf Okonkwo-Blackwood, watching High Marshal Thessarian Vale's face resolve on his display for what both men understood, without either needing to say it aloud, would be the final time they spoke as enemies. Felt none of the satisfaction that 6 years of grinding, costly war might reasonably have earned him. "Admiral," Vale said, and his voice carried none of the musical, unhurried confidence of their first exchange 4 months earlier, replaced instead by something quieter, heavier, the voice of a commander who had spent 4 months watching his species' fundamental assumptions about the shape of honorable warfare dismantled one atrocity at a time. "I am prepared to discuss terms of surrender." "You don't have to do that, Marshal," Okonkwo-Blackwood said, and meant it, because he had run the numbers himself that morning before this call and knew precisely how narrow humanity's margin remained even after 4 months of successful attrition. You've still got 340 warships left in this sector. We've got 161, most of them held together with field repairs and stubbornness. If you wanted to press the engagement, the raw numbers still favor you. I'd lose. Eventually, it'd cost you everything you've got left to do it, but I'd lose. I know, Vale said. I have run the same numbers, Admiral, more times than I can count. I am not surrendering because I believe I would lose a continued engagement, though I no longer believe I would win one cleanly either. I am surrendering because I have spent 4 months watching what your species is willing to do to avoid losing, and I have come to a conclusion that I suspect will trouble you more than it troubles me to say aloud. I do not believe there is a version of this war, however long it continues, in which you stop escalating before you win. You sacrificed 41,000 homes, though not thankfully 41,000 lives, to kill 148,000 of my people in 4 seconds. You emptied a second colony 6 weeks later and did it again on a smaller scale, and I have no doubt you would have found a third and a fourth, had this war continued long enough to require them. You have spent 4 months bleeding my logistics network dry through methods my own military ethics would never permit me to authorize against your side, however much strategic advantage they might offer, and you have shown me, at a place your reports call the series gap, that when even those methods run short, your commanders will convert their own crude warships into unguided kinetic weapons rather than yield a single defensive line. I do not believe, Admiral, that a 10-year war or a 20-year war ends any differently than this conversation ends today, except with a great many more dead on both sides in the interim. I would rather end it here, with my fleet and my people intact, than discover exactly how much further your species is willing to go to avoid defeat. Okonkwo-Blackwood was quiet for a long moment, watching the tired, defeated dignity in Vale's expression, and found to his own considerable surprise that he felt no triumph in this moment at all. Only the same hollow, grinding exhaustion that had accompanied every decision of the war's final 4 months. The exhaustion of a man who had become, deliberately and by necessity, exactly the kind of commander he had never wanted to be in order to save exactly the kind of species he had always believed was worth saving. He thought, in that suspended moment before he spoke again, of the notebook in the top drawer of his cabin desk, of the hundreds of names it now held, of the families who would spend the rest of their lives measuring their grief against a peace they would never fully understand the price of, and found that the weight of all of it did not lessen, even now, even with victory finally, formally in hand. It simply changed shape, settling from the sharp, immediate pressure of an ongoing war into something quieter and more permanent, the kind of weight a person learned eventually to carry rather than set down. For what it's worth, Marshal, he said finally, I never wanted to find out how much further I was willing to go either. I just made a decision 6 years ago that I'd rather live with whatever I had to do than watch my species get erased because I wasn't willing to do it. I don't feel good about the math I did to get us to this conversation. I want you to understand that. Every ship I sacrificed, every trap I built, every convoy my people died raiding, I remember all of it. I'll remember it for the rest of my life. But I'd do every bit of it again, exactly the same way, if it meant my species got to have this conversation instead of the alternative. That, Vale said quietly, is precisely what terrifies me about your species, Admiral, not your weapons, not your ships. The fact that you are capable of carrying that weight fully, honestly, without it breaking you into something incapable of continuing to fight. My people call that kind of resolve a virtue in the abstract in our histories and our teachings. We have never once had to test whether we actually possess it. You have tested yours repeatedly for 6 years and it has not broken. I do not know what a species does with that kind of resolve once a war is finally over, Admiral, but I confess I am glad, for the sake of my own people, that I will not have to find out the hard way. For what it's worth, Marshal, I don't think we know either, Okonkwo-Blackwood said. What a species does with that kind of resolve once the war's over, I mean. I've had 6 years to get good at the part where I do terrible math to keep my people alive. I haven't had one single day to figure out what a person does with that afterward once nobody needs the math anymore. I suspect I'll be finding that part out same as everyone else. May I ask you something, Admiral, before we finalize terms? Vale said, and there was something almost tentative in the question, the tone of a commander stepping outside the formal bounds of a surrender negotiation into territory that felt to him considerably more dangerous. Was there ever a point across these 6 years at which you considered simply surrendering rather than continuing to pay the cost your strategy required? Your species could have submitted to compact correction at any point. The terms, I am told, were never as punitive as your propaganda suggested. You could have spared yourselves Hestia 7, Perth's Landing, the series gap, all of it. Okonkwo-Blackwood considered the question with the same unhurried seriousness he had brought to every other exchange of the negotiation. I thought about it every single day, Marshal. I want to be honest with you about that since we're being honest with each other now. Every ship I lost, I thought about it. Every name I added to the list I keep, I thought about it. But thinking about surrender and being willing to do it aren't the same thing, and I never once got closer to the second than the first. Because the terms your compact offers aren't really terms, Marshal, not the way I understand the word. They're a slower version of losing, oversight of our development, confiscation of what we've built, a permanent ceiling on what we're allowed to become decided by somebody else forever. I looked at that ceiling 6 years ago and decided I'd rather spend every ship I had and every ship after that and however many names ended up in my notebook than let my species live underneath it. That's not bravery, Marshal. I want to be clear about that too. It's just the math I landed on, and I've never once found a better one since. The formal terms of the Kryx withdrawal from human space were signed 9 days later. Terms that Okonkwo-Blackwood, true to the promise he had made to himself 6 years earlier, kept deliberately, pointedly modest, no punitive reparations, no demand for Kryx territory, no attempt to extract from a defeated enemy anything beyond a permanent, verified withdrawal and a mutual commitment to peaceful contact going forward, because he understood. With the same cold clarity that had guided every ruthless decision of the war's final campaign, that a peace built on humiliation was simply a war deferred, and he had already spent 6 years learning exactly how much a deferred war eventually cost. There were voices within his own command structure, in the days that followed, who argued for harsher terms, who pointed out, not unreasonably, that a defeated Kryx fleet reduced to token reparations, and a simple withdrawal represented an historic opportunity to permanently cripple a species that had, after all, started this war unprovoked 11 years earlier with the destruction of Proxima Station. Okonkwo. Blackwood heard those arguments out, in full, in a series of tense command briefings aboard the Attrition, and rejected every one of them with the same quiet, unshakable conviction that had guided every other decision of the war. We didn't fight this war to become the thing that started it, he told his assembled staff in the last of those briefings 3 days before the formal terms were signed. I've done things these last 6 years I'll carry to my grave and past it if there's anything past it to carry things to. But I did them to keep us alive and free, not to build an empire out of somebody else's ashes. If we punish them harder than the war itself already has, all we're doing is guaranteeing there's a next generation of Kryx growing up on stories about what we did to their parents, and one day that generation comes looking for payback with a fleet twice this size. I'd rather end this clean. I'd rather end it in a way that doesn't need doing again in 40 years by somebody who isn't me. What he could not give himself, in the weeks and months that followed the formal end of hostilities, was the comfortable absolution of believing the war had been won cleanly, without cost, without the kind of permanent, unhealing wound that 6 years of ruthless necessity leaves on the people who carry it out. He attended, in the following year, 411 memorial services for crews lost across the war's final campaign, stood at each one in his dress uniform with his hands clasped behind his back and his face carefully, deliberately composed, and told himself each time the same thing he had told High Marshal Vale in their final conversation. That he would do it all again, Exactly the same way, because the alternative had never, not once in 6 years of grinding calculation, been a version of the future he could accept. Humanity did not celebrate the end of the war the way victories were celebrated in the stories Okonkwo-Blackwood had grown up reading. No parades filling the streets of Earth's cities, no triumphant fleet review beneath a sky full of fireworks. What celebration there was arrived quiet and exhausted, in the small, private moments of families reunited after years of separation, in the slow, unglamorous work of rebuilding shipyards and habitat stations, and the countless small institutions a species needs to feel again, like something other than a wartime machine built entirely around survival. The families of the 431 who had died aboard the Vigilance received their final notifications in the same quiet, unceremonious manner as every other casualty notice of the war, delivered by exhausted naval liaisons who had by that point delivered so many that the words had long since stopped feeling adequate to the weight they were meant to carry. The survivors of the series' Gap action, the crew of the crippled Widowmaker, the only ship of Marchetti's squadron to come home at all, were awarded medals in a ceremony that Okonkwo-Blackwood attended personally, standing at the back of the room rather than at its front, because he had decided, somewhere in the war's final year, that he no longer wanted to be photographed pinning medals on people whose survival had depended on three of their friends choosing not to survive alongside them. Admiral Yusuf Okonkwo-Blackwood retired from active command 18 months after the formal peace. In a ceremony he had specifically requested be small, private, and free of the kind of hagiographic language that 4 decades of military history had a habit of applying to commanders whose careers ended in victory rather than defeat. And in the years that followed, on the rare occasions younger officers asked him, with the particular reverent curiosity of people who had grown up in the peace his ruthlessness had purchased, how humanity had actually won a war against an enemy with 3 times its military strength. He gave them, every time, the same answer, delivered without embellishment, and without the comfortable heroism the question seemed to be fishing for. We didn't win because we were stronger, he told them. We won because we were willing to do the math nobody else could stomach doing, and because we never once let ourselves pretend that math was clean. Remember that part especially if you remember nothing else I ever tell you. The day you start believing that kind of victory is something to be proud of rather than something you simply had no better alternative to, that's the day you've forgotten what it actually cost. Don't forget what it cost. That's the whole job in the end. Not winning. Remembering what winning like that actually takes out of you, so the next time, if there is a next time, you go looking a little harder for a different answer before you reach for this one. More than one young officer, hearing that answer for the first time, pressed further, asking whether he regretted any single decision of the 6-year campaign. GN whether there was a version of the war he wished he had fought differently, and to that question, too, he gave the same answer every time, delivered with the same flat, unflinching honesty that had carried him through every dark calculation of the war itself. I regret all of it, and I'd do all of it again. Both of those things are true at the same time, and if anyone ever tells you they can't be, they've never actually had to make the kind of decisions I made. You don't get to feel good about this kind of victory. You just get to have one and to spend the rest of your life making sure it was worth what it cost. I'm still working on that second part. I expect I will be until the day I die. And in the quiet, unhurried years of his retirement, spent largely in the company of the surviving crew of the UNS Attrition at reunions held each year on the anniversary of the HFY 7 detonation, Admiral Yusuf Okonkwo-Blackwood never once described the war he had won as a triumph. He described it, when he described it at all, as a debt, one incurred in the desperate arithmetic of a species that had refused to be erased, and one he understood with the same unflinching clarity that had guided every terrible decision of 6 years of war. Humanity would be paying, in one quiet, private way or another, for a very long time to come.